Every weekend across the country, dozens of strangers crowd into narrow hallways and tiny apartments, offering over the asking price for a lease they haven't even had time to properly inspect. The vacancy rate sits near absolute zero. Rents are soaring. This leads to a recurring public question: who specifically broke the system? The reality is that no single villain or budget is responsible. No one in Canberra sat down and engineered a housing crisis. Instead, the crisis was built one policy at a time across 3 different decades. Governments from both sides of the aisle solved the immediate problem in front of them while creating a much larger problem down the road. To see the trap modern renters are in, we have to trace the paper trail backward. This is the 30-year history of how isolated, defensible decisions compounded into a systemic failure. This journey goes past the pandemic, past the financial crisis of 2008, and past the housing booms of the early 2000s. We land squarely in the mid-1980s. In 1985, the Hawke government convened a tax summit to overhaul Australia's revenue system. The decisions made in this room established the foundational rules that dictated every housing debate for the next 40 years. The first rule involved negative gearing. In 1985, the government quarantined the practice, meaning investors could no longer use rental losses to lower the tax on their regular, everyday salary. Those losses could only be offset against rental income itself. After fierce backlash from the property lobby, the government reversed course just 2 years later. Negative gearing came back in full. This reversal created a political precedent. Touching investor tax breaks was treated as electoral suicide. For the next several decades, the policy stayed off the table. In 1999, the Howard government altered the math again. Following the Ralph Review, they introduced a flat 50% discount on any capital gain held longer than 12 months. When combined with negative gearing, property investment became a highly effective tax strategy. An investor could run a loss on a rental every year, deduct that loss from their salary to pay less income tax, and then pay tax on only half the profit when they eventually sold the house. Losing money on paper year after year became a primary way to build wealth. Throughout the early 2000s, investor demand multiplied. These tax settings ensured that for thousands of Australians, a house was no longer just a place to live. It was a highly effective way to reduce a tax bill. As prices rose and investors crowded the market, the government attempted to help regular buyers compete. In 2000, they introduced the First Home Owner Grant, a direct cash payment to help with the deposit. Economists point to a consistent flaw with this kind of subsidy. In a market with a fixed number of homes, giving every buyer an extra $15,000 simply allows sellers to raise their asking price to capture the cash. Despite this mechanic, successive governments doubled the grant or introduced new ones more than a dozen times over the next 20 years, including during the 2008 financial crisis. The political fear established in 1985 remained. When federal proposals were made to reform negative gearing or capital gains during the 2016 and 2019 elections, they were defeated in campaigns that framed the changes as an attack on mom and dad investors. These cash grants created the appearance of helping buyers while ensuring the market became more expensive for everyone. Alongside tax breaks and grants, a third force was accelerating the market: financial deregulation. Throughout the 2000s, Australian banks were free to lend far more aggressively, and housing credit surged. While 3 separate factors pulled demand higher, the physical supply of new homes stayed relatively flat. State and local planning systems, largely untouched by federal tax changes, kept approval processes slow. Restrictive zoning limited the number of new homes built near jobs and transport. Demand had 3 accelerants: tax concessions, cash grants, and easy credit. Supply had none. Nobody planned this imbalance. It was simply what happened when 3 separate policy levers, controlled by 3 different levels of government, were pulled in the same direction for 20 years without anyone coordinating the result. This uncoordinated imbalance lasted for 20 years. Artificially stimulated demand was crashing into a wall of restricted supply. In 2020, the pandemic acted as a spark, hitting 30 years of accumulated fuel. Lockdowns triggered a rapid rollout of extreme demand stimulants. Historically low interest rates increased borrowing capacity to record levels, while home builder grants handed out $25,000 to anyone building or renovating. When borders reopened in 2022, net migration surged to the highest levels in modern Australian history, as students, skilled workers, and delayed arrivals all landed at once. Rental vacancy rates collapsed to record lows within 18 months. Rents rose at double-digit rates in some cities. The system reached a breaking point because decades of hyper-stimulated demand collided with a population shock that no one had built the housing supply to absorb. The scale of the current crisis has forced governments to move the levers that stayed still for 40 years. A national target of 1.2 million new homes was set, alongside a temporary ban on foreign buyers purchasing existing property. Most significantly, upcoming reforms will replace the 50% capital gains discount with an inflation-adjusted model and restrict negative gearing for existing properties, the first major change to these settings since 1999. Look at the 30-year timeline and a clear pattern emerges. Almost every policy in this story added more fuel to demand than to new supply. Over 3 decades, both major parties consistently prioritized helping people compete for homes rather than building the homes themselves. It is always politically easier to hand out money to help people compete than to build the homes that would end the competition. The next housing policy is already being drafted. History is waiting to see which side of the ledger it lands on.